Here we are at part 13 of our Resident Evil recap, where we're going to cover the events of Resident Evil 5, one of the most significant games as far as the series' overarching story is concerned. Not only does RE5 see the paths of longtime series veterans like Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, and Albert Wesker, it also brings resolution to several major long-running arcs. Now before we begin, this video is based on our understanding of Resident Evil 5's story and lore, and reflects our interpretation of its events as a refresher before Resident Evil Requiem. As always, we recommend that you make your own informed call by looking into the game yourself and ensuring that it matches your expectations, standards, and personal values. And also, just a heads up before we dive in, this is a newly edited, expanded, and restructured version of our earlier recap, now presented in 4K at 60 FPS. This entire recap series also includes coverage of Outbreak, Outbreak File Number 2, Umbrella Chronicles, and Darkside Chronicles, entries that we didn't include the first time around. Now with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Lost in Nightmares. Resident Evil 5 is set in the year 2009, about 5 years after the events of RE4 Remake, and 4 years after RE Revelations. Though we're actually going to start this recap a little earlier. First, we're going to talk about the RE5 DLC Lost in Nightmares, which is set in 2006, and moves a lot of the pieces into place for some of the main game's most crucial turns. As Lost in Nightmares begins, we see Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine on a BSAA mission, raiding an estate where they believe they are finally going to apprehend Umbrella Corporation's co-founder Oswell E. Spencer. Since Umbrella's activities were exposed and the company went under, Spencer has, as a wanted man, been in hiding, but the BSAA is now hoping to finally put him in chains to not only answer for his crimes, but also provide important information on Albert Wesker, his plans, and anything else he may know about him. Inside the estate, it's as if time has folded back on itself. Chris and Jill push through a series of terrors that mirror the nightmare that they survived in the Arklay Mountains, as though someone is forcing them to relive the Spencer mansion all over again. When they finally break into Spencer's office, they don't find the old mastermind waiting for them. They then find a corpse. Spencer's dead, and Albert Wesker is standing over him. Chris and Jill try to take Wesker head-on, but it is a losing fight. He dismantles them with ease, and when he's seconds away from killing Chris, Jill steps in, throwing herself at Wesker and sending them both crashing out of a window into a ravine below. No bodies are recovered, but the BSAA declares them dead. Chris, however, refuses to accept that Jill is gone. And with that, Lost in Nightmares wraps up. Chris and Sheva enter the scene. The story jumps ahead 3 years to 2009, where Resident Evil 5 begins with Chris and BSAA operative Sheva Alomar heading to West Africa to investigate bioweapon smuggling. Their main target is Ricardo Irving, a black market arms dealer set to broker a bioweapons transaction, something the BSA cannot allow to go through. Chris and Sheva's first objective is to make contact with BSAA's Alpha team in the Kijuju Autonomous Zone, where they are to receive further intel, but pretty much as soon as they land, they learn that things have already gone spectacularly wrong. Somehow the village that they land in has been completely overrun by people infected with a parasite, who now have to be eliminated. Meanwhile, Alpha Team has also perished, having been completely wiped out by a bizarre and terrifying new bioweapon. What Chris and Sheva don't know yet is that this bioweapon was created by a deadly new virus known as Ouroboros, but we'll get to that in a bit. Eventually, Chris and Sheva cross paths with BSAA's Delta team, which is led by Sheva's former mentor, Josh Stone, who proves to be the source of some crucial new details. He shows them data related to bioterrorist activities in the region, but in that data, Chris also discovers a relatively recent picture of none other than Jill Valentine. Given the fact that she's been presumed dead for 3 years, Chris is more than a little startled, and his theory that his former partner might still be alive begins taking stronger root. For the moment, bigger concerns take priority. The mystery deepens. Chris and Sheva pick the chase back up and nearly manage to corner Ricardo Irving, until a mysterious, hooded figure steps in at the last second and helps him slip away. What follows is a brutal gauntlet of BOW encounters, with Delta Team being almost completely wiped out along the way. When the time comes back to check in with BSA HQ, Chris puts it off. He's becoming convinced Jill isn't just alive, she's somehow tied to everything that's unfolding in West Africa. Getting to the truth and finding her takes precedence over procedure.
Sheva recognizes the stakes and chooses to stay with him.
Eventually, they catch Irving again, and this time there's no escape route, and no one coming to save him. Cornered, he makes a desperate move and injects himself with the parasite, mutating almost instantly into a grotesque, tentacled monstrosity.
Chris and Sheva bring him down, and with his last breaths in human form, Irving points them towards a nearby cave where he claims the answers are waiting.
He also names another player behind the operation, Excella Guione, head of Tricell's African division, and a key figure in the bioterror outbreak spreading across the region.
When Chris and Sheva get to the cave mentioned by Irving, the duo find the flower named Stairway of the Sun. The flower that, as we covered in part 1 of our recap of the Resident Evil series, was used to extract the progenitor virus, and is, in turn, basically responsible for every messed up virus and bioterror threat that the world has ever been faced with.
And that's not all that they find. They also discover an old Umbrella facility, which is now operated by Tricell, and is where the company has been conducting a lot of its twisted experiments.
As they push deeper into the facility, Chris and Sheva discover rows of containment pods designed to keep human test subjects imprisoned.
One of them stops Chris cold, an empty pod labeled Jill Valentine. They also finally get clarity on what they've been fighting. The outbreaks plaguing West Africa weren't random. They were orchestrated by Tricell's Excella Guione. She isn't acting alone. Excella is working with Albert Wesker, who's very much still alive. Wesker's endgame is Ouroboros. With Excella's support, he plans to launch missiles at multiple targets and spread the virus across the globe. The fallout would be catastrophic, but in Wesker's twisted view, that destruction is the point. He intends to reshape humanity, letting only a superior, new breed rise from the ruins. Jill Valentine.
In pursuit of Excella, Chris and Sheva make it out of the lab and proceed through a connected network of caves, only to be stopped in their tracks by Excella herself, and in the company of none other than Albert Wesker, along with the mysterious hooded figure that helped Irving when Chris and Sheva first tried to apprehend him.
And, well, the revelations just keep coming, because it's at this point that it's revealed that the hooded figure is none other than Jill Valentine. Since her presumed death 3 years ago, Jill has been Wesker's captive, during which time she was thoroughly brainwashed and constantly experimented upon. Now she's being mind-controlled by Wesker through a device strapped to her, serving as his unwilling puppet.
Excella and Wesker flee from the scene, while Jill stays behind to deal with Chris and Sheva and stop them from giving chase. The trio engage in a tense fight, and after much difficulty, Chris and Sheva finally manage to defeat Jill and rip Wesker's device off of her. Slowly, Jill comes back to herself, and incredibly weak though she is, she urges Chris and Sheva to go after Wesker and Excella, assuring them that she will be okay. A reluctant Chris agrees, and she and Sheva set off again.
The Desperate Escape.
With Chris and Sheva gone, Desperate Escape Story DLC picks up the thread.
Josh finds Jill barely conscious, collapsed on the floor. He pulls her up and tells her that beyond the mountain is a helipad which can be used for extraction. From there, the two cut through the Tricell facility, moving through various challenges while fighting off Magini that swarm the route. As the situation spirals further out of control, Jill remembers something crucial about Wesker and insists on reaching the communication center to get a warning to Chris. Josh sticks with her, since that path also leads them to their only way out. Now keep this in mind as we divert our attentions back to RE5's main story beats.
Wesker and Excella have fled to a Tricell-owned oil tanker, but Chris and Sheva manage to pursue them aboard.
Battling their way through waves of Ouroboros monstrosities, they finally corner Excella. The reunion is short-lived. In classic Wesker fashion, he turns on her without hesitation, coldly declaring that she was never anything more than a disposable pawn. To seal her fate, he injects her with Ouroboros, mutating her into a grotesque abomination that Chris and Sheva are forced to put down. By the time that Excella is defeated, Wesker is already moving on to the next phase of his plans. He prepares to launch from the tanker in a bomber, intended to deploy Ouroboros-loaded missiles across the globe. Chris and Sheva race after him, and it's during this desperate pursuit that Chris receives an unexpected call from Jill. This is where we switch back to the events of Desperate Escape once again. After 3 years as Wesker's captive, she learned more about him than anyone alive, and the fragments of that knowledge are finally starting to fall into place. She tells Chris that Wesker has to inject himself with a specific dose of a progenitor-based serum in order to make sure his body does not succumb to the soup of many infections that he's pumped into himself over the years. That means the serum, in turn, is also needed to maintain his superpowers. More importantly, according to Jill, if Wesker receives a larger dose than he needs to, the serum will effectively act as a poison, thoroughly weakening him.
Excella, it turns out, had several vials of that serum. Vials that she dropped when she was previously being chased by Chris and Sheva, and vials that, as luck would have it, Sheva smartly scooped up.
However, the transmission between Chris and Jill breaks. Jill and Josh now rush to the helipad to get the hell out of a location that is now being swarmed by zombies. The helicopter, piloted by Doug, finally reaches them, but he's killed by a missile while covering their escape.
Josh pilots the chopper out with Jill, and the two immediately head for Chris and Sheva's location.
Wesker's end.
As Wesker prepares the bomber for takeoff, Chris and Sheva storm the hangar and confront him at the very last second.
A vicious fight erupts, with Wesker once again proving just how evil he's become. Chris manages to inject him with an overdose of the serum, forcing Wesker to break off the fight and retreat into the cockpit.
He lifts off immediately, but not before Chris and Sheva cling on and haul themselves aboard the aircraft.
And the battle continues in midair as the plane roars through the sky. Amid the chaos, Chris lands another injection, weakening Wesker further, yet still failing to put him down. The struggle sends the aircraft spiraling out of control, and moments later it crashes violently into an active volcano.
Climbing free from the burning wreckage, Chris and Sheva are met with a grim realization. Wesker has survived yet again.
Enraged and refusing to accept defeat, he injects himself with an Ouroboros drawn directly from his missile payload, mutating into an even more grotesque and powerful form. One final battle follows as the volcano begins to erupt around them, the ground crackling and collapsing beneath Wesker's feet. At last, the lava consumes him entirely.
Moments later, Jill Valentine and Josh Stone arrive in a BSAA helicopter, pulling Chris and Sheva from the brinks as the volcano continues to tear itself apart behind them. As Chris and Sheva climb aboard, however, the ever-so-stubborn Wesker, which is really putting it mildly, thrusts a massive mutated arm out of the lava and grabs the chopper, preventing it from flying away from the exploding volcano. Desperate to be done with him once and for all, Chris and Sheva fire an RPG into Wesker's face, and this time, they finally kill him. And yes, we know that Wesker has died more times than we can count over the course of the Resident Evil franchise, but this time, he is actually fully dead. And that brings our recap of Resident Evil 5 to an end. When we return in part 14, we'll be talking about the events of Resident Evil Revelations 2. And that'll be about it for this one. If you guys like what we're doing at Gaming Vault, please consider subscribing to our channel, and I'll see you guys on the next video.